Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for a story this evening. This is part 2 of our story, so if you haven't heard part 1, click on the description because you don't want to miss the entire story. So before we continue, don't forget to go and get yourself that effervescent sparkling drink or something warm and comforting, and if you're drinking something rather special, let me know about it because I love hearing from you. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with part 2 of our story. Nothing happened. Lily opened her eyes, and the creature was standing there. It would seem the cloud cover from earlier on in the evening had dissipated, and this creature was basking in the ethereal illumination of a full moon, which lit up its features so brightly that every single detail was highlighted so generously. Lily had no idea what she was observing, as this creature was so human, the face distinctly feminine. The creature had 2 breasts that hung on her torso like large empty pockets, one significantly bigger than the other. As Lily's eye settled on the ambiguous creature's benevolent face, she knew at once it meant her no harm. It looked at her almost apologetically, and then words came into her head. "I didn't mean to scare you." Lily wondered where the voice had come from, as the words spoken to her were not her own, nor were they audibly articulated, but the voice was coming from inside her head. How did that even happen? "Did you speak to me?" she asked, looking at the creature incredulously. "Of course I spoke to you. I can see you're in trouble. You seem lost and confused. I see your ankle is bothering you," came the booming voice in her head. The hairy lady seemed genuinely kind. She had never encountered a creature like this before, which, although human, had primate influences in regards to the pyramid-shaped head and the overlong arms that hung well beyond the knees. And this incredible idiosyncratic phenomenon that enabled this hairy lady to talk to her telepathically was nothing short of incredulous. "You can trust me," came the voice in her head. Lily trembled as she looked at this giant-sized creature that dwarfed her so that by contrast she felt inconspicuous and small. Is that what it feels like to be an ant in the presence of a human being, she wondered. Next time she'd spare more compassion for small creatures, she thought. "I'm looking for a farmhouse," she told the hairy lady. "I need to find a farmhouse. Anyone will do. I need help. I had an accident quite a way away, back down on that road." The creature stared at her for a moment with a bemused look on its face, so Lily pointed to a dirt patch under a tree. She hurriedly cleared the leaves away from the topsoil, and with a twig she drew a house in the ground. The creature looked befuddled, scratching her head, as she studied Lily's incomprehensible scrawl that looked like a kid's scribble in the sand, with no discernible details that possessed any clarity. Lily looked back at her picture. Oh my God, she couldn't draw. She was no artist. She rubbed away her first attempts and tried again. The hairy woman nodded. She seemed to understand and began to draw in the ground a picture of a house. She drew trees and outbuildings, and her picture was remarkably good. It made Lily's attempts look juvenile and unpolished. Lily wished she could draw like that, especially in the soil. The creature then pointed in a southerly direction. "I can take you there, if you like," came the voice in her head. "It's the nearest house." Lily nodded, and the creature indicated for Lily to follow her, but seemed to become a little frustrated, as Lily was hobbling along like an old man, making very little progress on her legs. "You're too slow," came the voice in her head. "You move like a snail. Why don't you let me carry you there?" The hairy lady lowered herself down onto her haunches, so she was kneeling very low on the ground, indicating for Lily to climb up onto them. They were impressively large. They would easily make an NFL player's shoulder pads look puny and pathetic. Lily was reluctant to climb onto the shoulders of such an intimidating, awe-inspiring hairy lady, but she understood she wasn't going to get very far on her sprained ankle. It had been quite a hair-raising but thought-provocative night, one she was unlikely to ever forget. but the sooner she got help, the better. Lily nodded reluctantly in agreement, but with a vacillating hesitancy she ambled over towards the hairy lady and sat down firmly on her shoulders. They felt surprisingly comfortable and warm to the touch. The creature held on to her sneaker-clad feet and rose up from her feet onto powerful legs with a seamless grace, like a phoenix rising from the mist. Lily suddenly felt so tall. You could see so much at 10 feet off the ground, for miles and miles around, like a watchtower. At first she felt unduly nervous. Her heart began to pound through her chest with uncertainty, but the beats soon slowed down significantly to a steady rhythm. Something told her she could trust this hairy lady. If she had meant to harm her, she would have harmed her already, but instead had graciously offered Lily help when she needed it so much. And on an inauspicious night like this, when everything seemed to be conspiring against her, she was going to take her chances, and this hairy lady seemed like a safe bet. The hairy lady trotted from the road and galloped through the trees, her buoyant feet gliding across the ground, almost as if she was floating on air. Her agile movements were so graceful that Lily began to physically relax. Her ankle was throbbing, but it felt good to be off her feet. She enjoyed the feeling of the cool breeze blowing against her face, nudging her with fragrant kisses. She could hear the hairy lady's gentle breathing, the rise and fall of her chest, which was oddly comforting. She smelt of butterscotch, reminiscent of the ponderosa pines in the woodgrove. The creature began to whistle to herself as she ran steadily through the woodgrove, down earthen paths laced with fallen leaves and bracken, brushing past trees of every kind. Finally she arrived at a formidable-looking barbed wire fence, which she scaled in a single leaping movement, landing perfectly on her 2 feet like a nimble pussy-cat. That was when Lily saw under the scattered light of the moon the stoic silhouette of a farmhouse that stood proudly up against a dark sky. A couple of outside lights were on, but the rest of the farmhouse was steeped in darkness that suggested that the residents had obviously retired to bed. Lily cast her curious eyes around the farm. There were a few outbuildings, stable blocks, a gleaming-looking tractor, and other farm machinery parked outside the house under the canopy of a carport. But most of her vague impressions of the farmhouse were washed away by the twilight. The hairy lady put Lily down on the ground, so gently, almost as if she was afraid that Lily might break like a precious china doll. "You'll find help here," said the voice in her head. "I'll watch you from the trees over there. Call out to me if you still need me." Lily nodded. She thanked the hairy lady, who glided away. Lily could see her lofty form peeking at her from behind a tree, and felt reassured that the hairy lady was watching over her. Lily knocked on the door of the farmhouse with a loud rapping sound. She had no idea what time it was. She could hear a rustling sound, some shuffling feet that literally glided down a staircase at a quick pace, and a man's gravelly voice saying, "I'm coming." She could see a light coming on in the entrance hall and hear a latch being pulled back. There was a man standing in the doorway, possibly in his early 50s. He was wearing a dark velvety blue dressing gown and a matching pair of velvety slippers on his feet. He had a Sean Connery look about him. He wiped the sleep away from his silvery grey eyes and looked at Lily as if he wasn't quite sure whether she was real or part of an absurd dream that he might be having. "I'm sorry to disturb you," said Lily. "I'm afraid I had an accident on one of those country roads, a way back. Unfortunately, I pranged into a deer, and my truck veered off the road into a steep embankment. It's a complete write-off. The front of the car is buckled. It's a Mustang. The engine is no longer working. I need to use your phone, if I may." "Oh, please do mind my manners. You must come in at once. Are you sure you're all right? It sounds like you had quite an accident." "I'll be fine," Lily assured him. "I'm still a bit shaken, but I'll live." Lily felt relief wash over her as the man led her into his kitchen and insisted on preparing her a hot cup of cocoa. He studied her curiously through his silvery grey eyes. "Do you need to use the telephone right now? You do realise it's 1 o'clock in the morning. You might prefer to stay here overnight. Make the necessary call in a few hours. I have a spare room that you are more than welcome to use." What about your wife? Will she mind me staying over? I had no idea it was this late. It's just I don't want to intrude. Hadn't you better ask her if it's all right? If I stay, that is." The man stiffened uncomfortably. He ran a hand through his silvery locks, with a faraway distant look in his eyes, which made Lily wonder what he was actually thinking. "My wife died of cancer 7 years ago," he said, his eyes glinting with sadness. "I miss her every single day. But if she was here, she would be heartily glad to give you a bed for the night. I can assure you of that. My children are both at university, so they don't stay here anymore. I'm pretty much on my own here, apart from Augusta, who's my sheepdog. He's lying fast asleep in my bedroom upstairs. He's deaf in both ears, bless his soul. Otherwise, you can bet your cotton socks he'd have greeted you with a huge welcome. He loves people. He's a friendly dog." "I'm so sorry about your wife. My grandmother died of cancer 10 years ago, so I have an idea of what you went through. Cancer's got to be the most debilitating way to go, and it couldn't have been easy on your kids either. It's incredibly kind of you, dealing with the likes of me at this ungodly time of the morning. I do apologise. I guess time went by faster than I envisaged it would. I was so lost out there on that lonely road. I guess I will take you up on your offer. If I could stay in that spare room of yours, that would be wonderful. I'm exhausted. It's been such a long day. I sprained my ankle out there, stumbling around in the darkness, tripping over stones. I would appreciate phoning my boyfriend. I'm sure he's worried about me. I was supposed to have dinner with his family tonight. He might be concerned about my whereabouts, or he may think I got waylaid by my work and stood him up. It wouldn't be the first time I've let him down unintentionally." "I think you would be well advised to phone him in the circumstances. At least it'll put his mind at rest. How about I make you some warm cocoa and show you the way to my study? The phone is on the desk in there. You can make yourself comfortable and phone whoever you need to let them know you're safe." "Thank you. That's terribly kind," said Lily gratefully. "My name's Lily, by the way."
"Oh, do please forgive me. Mind my manners," said the kind man, extending a large hand. His handshake was firm and strong. "My name is Sid, short for Sydney. Sid Rawlings. Now let me take you to my study. You'll have some privacy in there."
Lily thanked Mr. Rawlings, fumbling around awkwardly on the wall for a light switch. Soon she found it and switched the light on. The farmer's study was impressively opulent. There was a gleaming rosewood desk in the corner, where a green lamp stood pride of place in the centre of this neat, uncluttered space, where everything had its perfect place, from pen holders to notepads and leather-bound diaries. There was one of those rather grandiose swivel office chairs that was upholstered in a sumptuous green leather, while Lily lowered herself onto it in order to make her phone call. The walnut floor, with its rich brown colour and purple hues, was covered in a flamboyant Persian carpet, and there were some large mounted photographs on the wall of Mr. Sid Rawlings standing between a couple of hefty-looking bullocks, wearing a cowboy hat and grinning boldly into the camera. He was better looking than Sean Connery, Lily decided. The kind of man Hollywood would have snapped up in a heartbeat if given the chance. But he didn't look as if he was remotely aware of his rugged handsomeness, which made him infinitely more attractive. Hanging proudly on the wall was the taxidermist head of a bull, with a sign underneath it which read, "Otis, you will never be forgotten. You were one of a kind, forever loved, Sid Rawlings." Lily decided that Otis must have been a very special bull to Mr. Rawlings. She sat down on the chair and reached out to grab the telephone, but was momentarily distracted by a selection of family portraits that were displayed on the right-hand corner of the desk. Lily didn't like being nosy, but curiosity got the better of her. She found herself looking at the family photographs, one that appeared to be of Sid Rawlings' wife and kids, in happier times when his wife was obviously still alive. The family looked so happy in the photograph together. It appeared to have been taken on a Hawaiian beach. It was the other photograph on the desk that nearly made Lily faint with astonishment. This was a photograph that she did not expect to encounter, and seemed so out of place on a desk in this farmhouse. But there it was, larger than life, standing there like a loud painting that you could not ignore, try as you might. It was a picture of Elliot's mother,
Alice Montgomery, draped lovingly in Sid Rawlings' arms. They were looking into each other's eyes as if they were besotted over each other. The picture had to have been taken very recently, as the necklace that Mrs. Montgomery was wearing around her neck was a present from Elliot, given to Mrs. Montgomery 6 months ago for her birthday. She had helped Elliot pick out that present. Elliot's mother was a happily married woman, so what was she doing in the arms of Sid Rawlings? Lily grabbed the picture in her hands, studying it closely. Mrs. Montgomery was a dark horse. Was she having an affair with Sid Rawlings behind her husband's back? In Lily's opinion, Mrs. Rawlings seemed happily married to her husband Simon, but perhaps appearances were deceptive. For a moment Lily stared at the picture, her eyes growing wider and wider. It would seem that Mrs. Montgomery may not be quite so squeaky clean as she appeared. She thought this with a measure of smug satisfaction. She reached for the telephone and dialed Elliot's family phone number, and luckily it was Elliot who answered the phone.
"Where the hell are you?" Lily, he grumbled. "Why didn't you turn up for dinner tonight? Everyone was expecting you. My mother is furious. She said you were being deliberately rude, that you stayed over at your offices and decided you weren't going to bother to come to dinner, after all the trouble she went to."
"It's not what you think, Elliot, I promise. I tried to take a shortcut on the country road, the one you told me about, and I got terribly, terribly lost."
"I showed you the shortcut to take during the day. You mean you took it at night? Are you crazy? It's so easy to lose your way down those country roads at night, when there are no street lights and everything looks much the same. Where are you now?"
"I'm absolutely fine, but my truck isn't fine, I'm afraid." There was a stiff silence at the end of the phone.
"What's wrong with your truck?"
"I ran into a deer, and it went rolling into an embankment, and the front of the Mustang is so badly buckled up, it's only good for scrap metal."
"You're kidding, right?"
"No, I'm not."
"Where are you then right now? Do you want me to come and collect you? It's not a problem. I can be there in a jiffy."
"I'm at Mr. Rawlings' farmhouse. Do you know him?"
"Yes, I know him. I've seen him around town a few times. Occasionally spoken to him very briefly. I think his wife died of cancer about 5 years ago. Or is it 7? I think it might be 7 years ago, actually. Good-looking man. He looks like a film star."
"That's the one. Anyway, I'm exhausted, and he says I can sleep over. He's been terribly kind. He's making me some cocoa even as I speak."
"Well, that's jolly good of him, isn't it? Well, then, if that's the case, I'll pick you up in the morning. Mr. Rawlings is a good man. He'll take good care of you. I know where his farm is, but are you sure you're all right? I don't mind picking you up. I really don't."
"I'll live, but sadly the deer was not so lucky. I got a sprained ankle to boot. Serves me right for stumbling around in the darkness trying to find a farmhouse. Luckily I had my torchlight with me."
"Well, thank God you found the Rawlings place. That's all I can say. It wasn't wise walking down a country road, Lily, in the middle of the night. But you're safe, so that's all that matters now. Please send my regards to Mr. Rawlings, and I'll see you both in the morning."
"Wait, you're not mad at me, are you, Elliot?" Lily almost whispered down the telephone.
"I was, but I am not any more, now that you've explained yourself. But it's my mother you're going to have to appease tomorrow. She's absolutely furious with you. I'm afraid she hasn't had a good word to say about you. She was going on and on about you being the most unreliable and self-centered girl she had ever met."
Why does that not surprise me? When Lily ambled into the kitchen after the telephone call, she was carrying the photograph of Mr. Rawlings and Mrs. Montgomery into the kitchen with her. She held up the photograph to Mr. Rawlings, his face coloured, going a deep shade of crimson. "I don't mean to pry, Mr. Rawlings, but why are you arm in arm with Alice Montgomery in this photograph? It's just that I know she's a happily married woman. Well, I think she is. Are the two of you having an affair of some kind? You see, Mrs. Montgomery is my boyfriend's mother. He's picking me up in the morning from your farmhouse, Elliot Montgomery. He tells me you know him. He sends his regards to you."
"That's right. I know Elliot very well."
Mr. Rawlings sighed. He indicated for Lily to take a comfortable seat at the kitchen table, which she did.
her eyes steadily focused on Mr. Rawlings as she waited for his explanation. "Where to begin? I was at school with Alice Rawlings, you know. I had very strong feelings for her since I was 12 years old, but I was far too shy to do anything about it. When I was 20, I met my beautiful Bridget, and I married her. She was unequivocally the love of my life. But after she died, I got terribly lonely. One day I met Alice Montgomery in town. I recognized her at once from our days at school. We got talking in a supermarket together. I invited her over for coffee. One thing led to another. We've been seeing each other now for 5 years, and we really love each other very much."
"I understand that, but you do appreciate that Mrs. Montgomery is a happily married woman. Is it right for her to be cheating on her husband like this? And you, having an affair with her, you're encouraging her."
"Of course I understand where you're coming from, which is why it makes things all the more complicated. You see, Alice is madly in love with her husband Simon, and madly in love with me at the same time. She can't make her mind up between the two of us. She's stuck between a rock and a hard place. She doesn't want to hurt Simon, so we've been seeing each other secretly for 4 years. We tried to end things, but we couldn't. The arrangement suits us very well, but we don't want anyone to get hurt in the process. No one needs to know about our cosy arrangement. I would appreciate your discretion in the matter. If you say anything to Alice's husband Simon, or to Elliot, it could tear them apart, and I would hate that to happen. I would hate to be responsible for that."
"It's none of my business, Mr. Rawlings. I won't say anything in the circumstances, but I will tell Alice that I know her secret."
"Fair enough," said Mr. Rawlings.
That night, when Lily went to sleep in the spare bedroom of the farmhouse that looked like it had belonged to one of the Rawlings children, as there were children's books strewn on shelves, displayed neatly in alphabetical order, and a selection of antique teddy bears wearing sailors' hats and navy uniforms that were artfully displayed on the top shelf of a glass display cabinet, while some model aircraft were hanging from the ceiling in mid-flight. The bed was a comfortable double, with a springy mattress, sumptuously covered in a patchwork quilt that had been meticulously handcrafted. Lily wondered if it had painstakingly been made by Mrs. Rawlings, and if it was her work. If that was the case, she had been quite the seamstress in her day. As Lily climbed into the cosy bed, she pondered over the strange idiosyncratic events of what she would later describe as the most peculiar night of her entire life, that had serendipitously led her to Mr. Rawlings' farmhouse, the accident with the deer she had killed, the curious hairy lady that had so graciously carried her to Mr. Rawlings' farmhouse, and now she had unearthed a dark secret that had rudely exposed Mrs. Montgomery's dirty laundry. If the events of the evening had not aligned so perfectly, she would have been none the wiser about Alice Montgomery's smouldering secret. Who would ever guess in a million month of Sundays that such a stiff, unapproachable woman like Mrs. Montgomery had won over the hearts of 2 very kind men, who were clearly besotted over her? The woman needed a personality transplant. Was love really that blind? Or maybe, just maybe, there was a small possibility that there was a nicer side to Mrs. Rawlings that Lily was not acquainted with. She found it impossible to believe that anyone could possibly love such a condescending woman with the tongue of a viper that was so quick to spout poison. Mrs. Montgomery presented herself as the kind of woman without blemish, who meandered through life like a smooth river flowing seamlessly along its course, with no jutting rocks to interrupt its discharge. But in reality, the woman had issues with her life. Lily knew if she told Elliot or Simon Montgomery what she knew, it would tear the family apart, and she just could not do that to them. Besides, she really liked Mr. Rawlings, and if Alice Montgomery floated his boat, well, who was she to deny the man any happiness? She had no right to sit in judgment of other people's choices, and there was always this distinct possibility that Simon Montgomery knew exactly what was going on, and had conveniently turned a blind eye to his wife's adultery for fear of losing her. Lily suddenly realized that she had leverage with Mrs. Montgomery,
the woman who was trying her utmost to destroy her relationship with her son Elliot. But now that Lily knew her dark secret, she knew that Mrs. Montgomery might actually cut her some slack and stop interfering in her relationship. For the first time she felt empowered. Her head hit the pillow, and she was out like a light. She wasn't sure what had woken her up in the morning. Was it the smell of bacon permeating through the house, or the rude morning sunlight audaciously streaming through the windows? She couldn't be sure. For a moment she glanced around the strange room, looking rather bemused. Where was she? The memories of the following night came flooding back into her mind, furnishing her memories with all the details. It had been so surreal, like a dream. But in the clear light of the new morning, Lily knew that the previous night had been anything but, and her thoughts went from the hairy lady to the photograph in Mr. Rawlings' study of him and Alice Montgomery, arm in arm together. Lily pulled back the curtains and stared out at the farm. It twinkled under the morning light, and on the meadows in the distance she saw a plethora of grazing steers, so she realised that Mr. Rawlings must run a cattle ranch of some kind. The door of her bedroom pushed open, and a black and white sheepdog was standing in the doorway. It came bounding up to her, wagging its tail profusely. This must be Mr. Rawlings' deaf dog. But he seemed so young and lively, not remotely affected by his impediment. The dog seemed to be encouraging Lily to get up, almost as if she was a sheep of some kind that he needed to tow into line. She had gone to sleep in her clothes from the previous night, and a quick glance in the mirror on the dresser confirmed her very worst fears, that she was a sorry sight indeed. Dishevelled, covered in mud, bloodstains on her hands, and red spatters of wine across her clothes. Her hair looked like a tangled bird's nest, splayed messily in gnarled knots around her face. Goodness gracious, she hadn't even bothered to wash her hands when she'd entered the farmhouse last night. They were in a disgusting state. That had been because of her exhaustion. She managed to find a bathroom and hurriedly washed her face and hands, and finally ambled down the staircase with the sheepdog at her side, who seemed to be escorting her around the farmhouse as if she was a distinguished guest or a celebrity of note. As Lily got to the bottom step of the staircase, she heard the low mumble of voices, one she recognised as Elliot's. She could hear him laughing in the kitchen. The smell of bacon became stronger, and Lily's stomach began to groan with hunger. She remembered she hadn't eaten anything from the previous night. When Lily entered the kitchen, she was surprised by the animated voice of Elliot. He'd been presented with a large plate of bacon and eggs from Mr. Rawlings, and was talking with his mouth full, waving his fork around. Elliot seemed unusually excited, and neither man had noticed Lily standing there, watching them like two men on a film set.
"Well, I saw her car, Mr. Rawlings. It was quite some accident she had, you know. You mark my words, she's lucky to be alive. The car of hers is a complete write-off. In truth, I'm surprised she didn't get killed. She must have hit that deer and been flung forwards to the embankment. But God only knows how she managed to find her way from Loganbury Lane to your farmhouse. It's quite a way away, let me tell you." "It is indeed. How the hell did she find her way to my place on foot from Loganbury Lane? That's very, very strange. It's quite a stretch, you know. You would have to take a shortcut through the woods to get here. The mind boggles. So what was this you were saying about a strange creature you saw?" "Well, I was driving down various roads looking for Lily's truck, and when I saw it, I was stumped. I got out of my truck to examine the damage to her Mustang. I turned around to look for the deer that she claimed to have hit. That was when I saw a tall, lofty creature, about 10 foot tall, walking away from the road with a dead deer flung over its shoulders. This thing was huge. I never got to see the face. It had cinnamon-coloured hair, long and flowing, and definitely a human gait, walking on 2 legs. And I forgot to mention this thing was humongous. I've never seen anything so big before. I think it must have been about 10 foot tall. It was huge. Now that bypasses any bear, surely." "Well, I guess it was going to eat the deer," said Mr. Rawlings reflectively. "But are you still sure it wasn't a bear?" "Definitely not. It seemed human." "That is strange," said Mr. Rawlings. "Oh, there she is."
he said, looking up at Lily with a bright, warm smile on his face.
I hope you slept well last night, young lady. Or yesterday morning, should I say? He pointed at Elliot with the back of his serving spoon. This young man has come to pick you up. He spotted your truck on the way here. He thinks you had a very lucky escape. I hope you're hungry, Lily. I happen to have made you some bacon and eggs. Elliot here has already demolished 2 helpings, so I'm not a very bad cook. When my wife died, I couldn't even boil an egg. But unless I wanted to eat bland food for the rest of my life, I had to step up my game. And these days I can turn out a good spread. Good on you, Mr. Rawlings. Your food is amazing, said Elliot appreciatively.
I'm starved, said Lily, so I'd love some of that bacon and eggs if it's going spare. Elliot ran over towards her, impulsively to give her a hug.
When I saw your accident, Lily, I'm not going to kid, I got the shock of my life. Do you realize you could have been killed? Your truck is a complete write-off. It's far worse than I imagined.
Elliot's face looked pained.
When I saw your truck like that, it scared the hell out of me. I don't know what I would do if anything happened to you, Lily. It made me realize how much I love you. It made me appreciate what we have together.
Lily flushed. Thanks, Elliot.
Young love, said Mr. Rawlings, giving the couple a big grin. There's nothing quite like it. Believe me, I know.
This time it was Elliot's turn to flush.
Do you know, Lily, Mr. Rawlings over here went to school with my mother many years ago. They were in the same class together, I believe. He says he vaguely remembers my mother. He thinks he's seen her in town from time to time. It's such a small world, is it not? Who would have thought it?
It is, isn't it, said Lily, seeing Mr. Rawlings giving her a big wink and responding in kind. When Lily and Elliot arrived at the Montgomery farmhouse, Mrs. Montgomery was standing in the doorway with her hands on her hips, her face so sour it could curdle milk.
Oh dear, said Elliot, Mum's in a foul mood.
Lily did not feel intimidated. Not any more, not knowing that she had a trump card up her sleeve, which she would use to her advantage if the need arose. She waved at Mrs. Montgomery, flashing her a bright, warm smile. Mrs. Montgomery's face grew red. A sizable frown on her face significantly deepened. As usual, she was impeccably turned out, wearing a loose black cotton top and white slacks, with a pair of swanky sandals adorning her perfectly manicured feet. Mrs. Montgomery's raven-coloured hair was swept away from her face in a neat ponytail, but in Lily's eyes the woman could never be attractive. She was such a cold fish. Both Simon Montgomery and Mr. Rawlings were way too good for the likes of her. Lily climbed out of the truck and headed towards the front door, her sneakers crunching the pebbles beneath her feet. Mrs. Montgomery appeared to be deliberately blocking the arched doorway, almost as if she had absolutely no intention of allowing Lily to cross the threshold of their home.
Look what the cat dragged in! My, you do look frightful, young lady!
Lily smiled at Mrs. Montgomery.
You think this is funny?
Said Mrs. Montgomery, glaring at Lily with a blazingly indignant look.
I saw you sniggering at me in the car, as if butter wouldn't melt in your mouth. I prepared a great dinner for you last night, but you didn't even bother to show up, and you expect me to invite you into my home after such blatant rudeness. You can think again, young lady. Look at you. God knows what Elliot sees in you. You look as if you've been dragged through the hedge backwards. Oh, I can't believe the way you present yourself today. It's not what you think, Mother. You've got your wires crossed, said Elliot, leaping to Lily's defence. If you must know, Lily had good reason for not showing up for dinner last night. She had an accident. She got stranded on a dirt road. She ran over a deer. Her car is now a write-off.
Mrs. Montgomery rolled her eyes in the back of her head.
Why does that not surprise me at all? She said sarcastically. You probably weren't looking where you were going.
The deer just came out of nowhere, said Lily defensively. I couldn't stop in time.
Always excuses with the youth of today, said Mrs. Montgomery. Always making excuses for themselves. Every time something untoward happens, it's always somebody else's fault. They're never willing to take responsibility. What is wrong with this generation? Mum, please will you cut Lily some slack? Her car's a write-off. She's very lucky to be alive. Well, she should have been looking where she was going, shouldn't she? It's the deer I feel desperately sorry for, losing its life like that to a deranged driver. I imagine the poor thing has got to be dead. Everyone should know to drive with great care down those country roads. Far too many deer these days are getting killed needlessly by these selfish drivers who only think about themselves. Believe it or not, Mum, I've just picked up Lily from Mr. Rawlings' farmhouse. She stayed over there last night, would you believe it, in one of his son's bedrooms. Very nice man. Looks like Sean Connery. He remembers you, Mum, very well. You were at school together, in the same class.
Mrs. Montgomery's face paled.
Yes, I remember him. You stayed last night at Mr. Rawlings' farmhouse, did you, Lily? She asked, her brown eyes pinned on her. That's right, I did. Very nice man. Too bad his wife died 7 years ago from cancer. He must get terribly lonely in that farmhouse all on his own, with both of his kids at university. He has to run that ranch, all on his lonesome, you know.
Mrs. Montgomery looked tongue-tied, almost as if Lily's words had stabbed her rudely, punching her in the face. It was a satisfactory feeling, and Lily sensed that finally she had the upper hand. She leaned forward and whispered into Mrs. Montgomery's ears. I know all about your secret, Alice. You and Mr. Rawlings together, your cosy little love affair. If you dare try and mess me and your son Elliot, our relationship up, I'll let the cat out of the bag and air all your dirty linen for everyone to see. And I'm quite sure your husband and Elliot would love to know what dirty stuff is in your linen basket.
You wouldn't, gasped Mrs. Montgomery. You can't.
I won't say a word, Mrs. Montgomery, if you keep your nosy butt out of my relationship with your son. If you interfere, I will tell him everything. All these years later, Lily is now happily married to her husband Elliot, who is the quintessential love of her life. But she knows without the trump card up her sleeve, her mother-in-law would have stopped at nothing to ruin their relationship. Thankfully, the woman has not interfered with their relationship. She does not want her husband or son to find out her dirty little secret. But Lily has no intention of spilling the beans, as she doesn't want to cause Simon Montgomery and Elliot any more hurt. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.